Welcome to another Smart QA Musings, which is titled as The Rise of QA Synthesist. An interesting word. It's really a synthesis of the words specialist and generalist. Just checking before I continue any further if you have any hearing. Is slide visible? Can you hear me? What are the chat window? That'd be great. Just want to be sure that I don't have a problem. Okay, thank you. So we all think about QA as in terms of going broad and getting a larger picture, or sometimes see it as an act of going deep to get into the depths. So it's not just superficial looking at behavior, looking at it from variety, different angles, starting from purpose, the situation, the environment, the users, flows, features, code, structure, architecture, and so on. So we can go depth-wise, we can go breadth-wise. We can look at various facets. Then the question that we try to grapple with, especially now, is it deep? Is it wide? Or is it a mix? And I think the normal answer would have been probably mix. But more importantly, I think they're really asking a bigger question: is it about seeing differently? Is it just the width or the depth? And therefore, I think that's where synthesis comes into the picture here. More so simply because of the changing landscape that we have, where we have obviously systems that are rapidly evolving. There is probably a lot of interdependencies that we have, not just within our own pieces of code and our systems, but also with externalities that exist. And certainly the speed at which we develop in the direction that we take, which is constantly shifting. So that's what I do, velocity. So as we obviously talk about this, QA, is it an act of execution? Or is it something more? Is it an act of executing to find issues, to assess systems? Or is it something more? Is it about making sense and therefore be a more meaningful party in the context of business? Certainly, a significant part of our work probably is spent in assessing, validating, checking, testing, etc. But there's also, I think, a larger expectation of something more in terms of making sense in the larger picture, which is what I think the role slowly shifts into the notion, not depth, not breadth, but shift the difference into a synthesis. So it's probably going away. It's probably expansion in some sense of the scope from this, what might have been earlier, where we were focused on the sense of coverage from a perspective of quality, and therefore look at it. This sure that we have looked at it from breadth, we looked at it from depth, and therefore we are comfortable with the coverage. Probably now it's a shift. It's a drift into the idea of coherence. Are we able to make sense of the larger context? Well, there are issues, there are things that are done, there are things that are not well done, there are things that are partially done and not done, and so on. Things that are shifting outside, customers changing over days. So I think we are trying to see if we can make whether we, from our role, is it important for us to help us see the larger coherence rather than just limiting the coverage? And that is probably the tone setting, if you will, of, in some sense, saying it's not just specialization, it's not generalization, it's a shift, and therefore maybe it's a meaningful combination of shift and therefore a synthesis. Pictorially, I think we understand that going into the depths of the ocean, so to speak, looking at the broader expanse of the ocean and seeing multiple areas, so we're not just limited to the product or the test or the environment. We're looking at it from market, users, money, value proposition, so on and so forth. So that we don't just look at it isolation as in quality as well. Yes. So that's really the generalist notion. That's where things like systems thinking come in handy. And when you look at it, when you try to put these together and you kind of invent, if you will, a word called synthesis, what are we really we're talking about the idea of emergence, right? We're talking about the idea of being able to synthesize information in some sense, which spans across depth and breadth, and see potential emergence of interesting things, some which may be nasty, some which may be okay and acceptable, and some, yeah, would be nice to have. And therefore, the idea of emergence, which I think in a very crude and a simple fashion, we might think of it as shift left or prevention and stuff. But I think that the word of synthesis and the idea of emergence probably elevates it to a much higher pitch. And what we're therefore really talking about or muse about here is to look at it from, hey, maybe the real world today, qualities is, it probably needs a little more expansive notion. It needs probably a good intersection of the ability to detect patterns, variety of different patterns, not just limited to bugs or defects. It's usage, environmental shifts, changes, customer shifts in some sense, issues. Certainly the idea of patterns spanning across. And obviously when you cut across system fluency, that means we're talking about it from a more expansive notion of system as a larger system made up of not the code of the product, but the larger system of people, product, teams, business, customers, market shares, profits, revenues, and so on. So you can look at it at a larger perspective and being able to establish the various connections. And that is really the idea of emergence. So we're just trying to examine. So our role seems to be shifting in some sense. Expectations are changing. Tools are also becoming interesting in the entire process. We are also awarded, we are also given, we also have the luxury today of intelligent system which can assist us, right? So if I kind of think about it, maybe we're all slowly, in some sense, morphing into some kind of a synthesist. And what is it all about? It's not about just being defined by tools, physical or mental, but to a larger degree, we are talking about how they connect and think and connect, right? So certainly when we talk about tools, more often we're thinking about physical tools, and most of it are software-ish tools. But then I think when you elevate it and think of it from mental tools, and then you look at it from establishing the ability to think on a variety of different aspects, as we talk about recognition of patterns, connecting to larger pictures, and so on. And then being able to ultimately connect is what probably a synthesist is trying to do. And therefore, maybe we are slowly expected to, in some sense, become that, to add a lot more value to systems that we are building today, which are complex, which are fast, and so on, which I think we talked about as the changing landscape, right? So having established the idea that maybe it is not anymore just breadth or depth, but it's about emergence and synthesis, what might be certain core capabilities of the new age QA synthesist? What may be some of them? So as I can see, some of them could be like this, the idea of contextual intelligence, right? We all talk about context. We all talk about how it's very important to be able to understand the larger context of where we are. It's not about the spec. It's not about the future. It is about the now, more or less, right? And the context is, as you can see, it's probably goes from all the way from code in the product to the way it is architected to the team that builds it and consumes it, and finally the business which ultimately profits by it in whatever form. And what we're really saying is, are we reading the larger environment, the context, or are we just looking at it from requirements? So the shift is probably we're not reading anymore just requirements, whether it's written or unwritten. When I say reading, it could be reading, discussion, etc. But when we talk about requirements, we more often tune in to the context of requirements as in terms of a product and an application. But then when you look at the environment, we're not talking about just the software-ish environment. We're looking at the larger environment of the software, the business, the team, and so on. So customers, changing needs, market pressures, and so on. And therefore, contextual intelligence is probably therefore a very key capability that a QA synthesist possesses, right? And what that primarily means is you're able to tune into the pace of delivery, which shifts, priorities of the users, which also morphs, and probably the constraints that we all have, which shifts and keeps on getting worse in some sense, right? And therefore, we are not anymore just reading the environment, and therefore what happens? We probably don't have anymore as much of rigidity in the strategy, or simply we are probably in a much more fluid environment, constantly adjusting, morphing, driven by the notion of context awareness, which probably is a fairly serious skill that is necessary and needed. Therefore, the reflective question in the core capability of contextual intelligence really is more reflective question is, are you reacting to what is given, or are you responding to what is needed? And that's a shift, right? So if I were to just do a particular act more often, I would end up reacting. But if I'm having a larger picture, if I'm completely aware, if I'm very much in the context, then maybe the way I react is not a reaction anymore. I respond and adjust, make some sense, and that's why it becomes a sense making as it is. So this probably is an interesting skill that we all understand and probably know in the context of test and design, but we're expanding slowly. What does this help? What is the next capability? It's about not just the act of doing and therefore seeing the symptoms of a problem like an issue, but actually sensing signals before they become symptoms, and therefore the core skill more like that of sensing. So what does that really mean? We find issues, we see some interesting observations, we have access to some logs, some feedback, we see some family in terms of timing, performance, loading, and so many other things. So what you see on the left side is probably not just three, just a sample field. So what we're really doing mentally is to kind of seek the cues from various signals, which could be issues, observations, interesting situations, actual feedback from support or somebody or the net. And therefore, what you're constantly trying to do is to sense these signals, form some hypothesis, and therefore, in some sense, use that to validate, to potentially find out any hidden instability, if you will. And therefore, we're not just looking at the obvious, but we're fundamentally going beyond. And what we're trying to reflect on, therefore, is, do you run tests to confirm, or are you running tests to discover? Which I think is what the word we use sometimes in context of exploration, right? So the whole idea here is about being very aware of sensing signals and using structural hypothesis and running them as experiments in a way, which ultimately sometimes turns out to be risks, some of them turns out to be some interesting ideas and so on. So the second core capability of a synthesist probably is the ability to sense patterns. Third, idea of translating or idea of having conversation or translating information across multiple roles. So what do we mean? I mean, there are developers, there are probably us as QA, there are probably business folks, and I've largely put it into three buckets here. You can, of course, break it down into various different roles. You can say product owners, you can say product marketing, and so on and so forth, but I'm just largely. So when I'm kind of playing the role of a synthesist, one of the key capabilities is it's not about just finding bugs and looking at it from a technical view and saying, something happened, maybe there's a null pointer, there's an exception, and therefore that's a bug. What probably we're trying to do is you're trying to translate it across higher roles. Maybe if we take the higher role of a user, for example, it might translate to this null pointer exception resulted in probably failing of, let's say, assuming it's some kind of booking software or application. Well, booking failed and the guy didn't have an explanation. He didn't know why I couldn't book a ticket. And therefore, what that primarily means is you're converting that idea you're not talking about it from an issue as a null pointer, but you're actually looking at it from a higher sense of saying, hey, this could result in a drop in conversion rate. So therefore, people might book less and therefore you might lose money or not make as much money. So what we really, the capability here of a synthesist here is, are we able to translate information across different roles so that the bugs that we may find make sense to that lot of people? So are you just documenting issues or are you getting heard? Which I guess is interesting because in some conversations that I've had folks, they do feel upset that they had logged in certain issues and nobody seemed to care as much. And the question is why? And they feel obviously sometimes hurt because they spent a lot of effort, but apparently they were not given that kind of a hearing. The problem is the other guy probably didn't understand what that means in their context. So the ability, what that might mean possibly, maybe I didn't do a good enough job to translate the actual symptom, what I found as possibly an issue maybe related to, in this case, some funny exception, into what it means into the business context for higher level, or what it means to the end user and therefore how it may affect his or her expectations. And therefore, are we heard? Are findings being heard? Or are we just doing it in terms of documenting it? And therefore, that becomes another interesting core capability of a synthesist, right? So it's again not deep or wide, but the idea that continuing on the similar trail of thought, we might get a lot of information. We might get a lot of data, maybe from logs, from measures, from feedbacks, from test runs, from playing with the software, and so on and so forth. And we will probably connect them in some sense, right? We will make some connections, we'll find out causes, we might even fix some of them. But then it is not about causality, it is about systemic fragility. It is about saying, if I can integrate the various disparate data that we have, which we might ascertain from the running of a system and therefore some logs, or some measures that we get while running or doing or before, or maybe real time or past feedbacks and current runs and current whatever form that we're doing. And if you're able to kind of integrate this information, which are available as interesting signals, remember we talked about pattern sense and making sense, then probably we get a better sense of system fragility. Are these things on that you do every day and that is full time? Maybe not. It is some of these skills, I think, or some of these capabilities are probably helping us or could help us to manage higher degrees of complexity and become more valuable. And of course, find those few interesting business risks that could seriously affect the company at large. Well, there could obviously be a lot of standard, simple, irritating issues and comments that we still have to do. But this core capability of an integration or integrated thinking, so to speak, of being able to fuse disparate data to generate insights, to meaningful insights, and if you're able to translate that across different roles by sense making, as we talked about, then our roles, our value or contribution to the large is much higher. And that is where I think the role of synthesis is emerging. And therefore, we are seeing not just the within, we are seeing the across, right? And if I were to pose it as a reflective question, what that would mean is, are you just following the symptoms, which is issues, observations, risks, etc., or are you assembling interesting stories which are heard, which probably make people think a little differently, which allow value to be delivered? So what I alluded to over the last few minutes was to kind of probably muse about certain ideas of what may be some new capabilities that are required, which I'm quite sure all of us are doing in various sense. It is just a nice way of putting it, if you will. Right? And so we're saying it's about integrated thinking. And of course, the final one, which we all talk about, is as retrospectives, analysis, RCAs, and so on, which is notion of a larger context would be to look at it from reflective practice or reflexive practice. How can you constantly tune your thinking? For example, is it the right test? Am I solving the right problem? What assumptions you're carrying? And it's constantly trying to reflect. So what we started off with contextual intelligence of being in the present, slowly moving into a notion of pattern sensing, and then moving on into integration and so on. What we're now saying is we're constantly trying to have a feedback loop in the entire system while we're doing things, and then constantly questioning, am I doing the right thing? Am I solving the right problem? Am my assumptions are okay at this point in time? And therefore continuously adjust, which I guess is probably one of the hallmarks of what we would want as in the context of the agility and the agile practice that we're trying to do. So this is probably another, or maybe the fourth code. In this case, the last core capability, if you will, the ability to constantly tune your thinking so that we are discarding and creating a view and adjusting some stuff, right, of what we do. And therefore, it's just reflecting. So the bigger question, really, a reflection one would be, are you testing the system, or are you thinking about the system at large? I use the word system in a very broad sense, in the sense, as the word indicates, it's not just about the product, it's the product in the larger context, right? Which spans across roles, it spans across technical to the business, so to speak. And then we're saying, are you just testing, or are you constantly thinking about the system as a whole and adjusting, tuning practices, processes, tools, whatever that is, so that we can hopefully deliver higher value and meet whatever expectation that is there. So the reflection, the ability to reflect is probably a fairly core skill. And this is not a one-time effort that we're talking about. Okay, every 3 months we reflect, or every release end we reflect. We're trying to probably look at it as a practice, which becomes in some sense part of my habit. And I'm trying to constantly attempting to do that in the back of the mind without working too hard on that. So given these facets, if some of these ideas, what happens? What is an impact? How does it help? So there are different folks we work with. We work with people who construct, people who conceive the product idea, people who run the operations, and people who are business folks who benefit from it, and therefore as a collective we benefit. What are we talking about? What is the intent? What is the strategic impact if I were to be a synthesist, as a QA synthesist? One, the ability to constantly and ensure that I'm in alignment with end outcomes, not just in terms of product quality outcomes, right? And I'm constantly navigating a sense of complexity and not just testing it. So which means I will revisit certain practices which will not allow me to navigate as fast, right? So I'm not just looking at it from a testing, I'm trying to elevate a little bit. Certainly I'm attempting to speed it up, cut through chasms, and probably therefore accelerate so that the assurance that we do is fundamentally meaningful, aligned with the outcomes quite obviously. Right? And that's probably the key impact, if you will, of a synthesis at large. Right? So we talked about certain capabilities, we talked about the reason as to why breadth and depth and synthesis role. And here I want to kind of muse about and conclude, if you will, on other challenges. I mean, it's nice to talk about in the 30 minutes, but then, is it real? Is it meaningful? Is it whatever? Nothing comes without challenges. Today, we might talk about it nicely, put together the presentation and share this with you, but the ownership of some of these are not, I don't own it. It is a collective. So there is a distributed ownership. The architecture is interdependent on so many different things. It's not just my architecture as a product. So it's dependent on so many other things. there is a constant sense of a pressure of delivering something, right? Which means we are putting out stuff at a frequent stuff. And of course, the notion of AI, which is a new factor that we've added, the sense of that it is not necessarily predictable, because there are things that we're still grappling with. The answer is not the same. Answers are different slightly. So, and as we are building more intelligent systems using ideas of AI, there are new challenges it throws. But then I'm not musing about what the solutions are. I just wanted to put in context. Yes, there are challenges, and I'm sure all of us will figure out ways to navigate it to the best of their ability. Right? So given the fact that these are certain core competencies, so to speak, or skills, and then challenges and impacts, so what can I do? What would be certain ideas that I could use to practice so that I can shift? One, the practice of constantly journaling across systems to switching zoom level. What does it mean, zoom level? That means you're talking at the highest level, lower level, and lowest level, right? So are we able to see, the individual trees? Are we able to go up and see, the forest as a whole? And what we're trying to say is, are we able to switch across different levels and be able to see the larger picture, the middle picture, and the deeper picture, and so on? And that's a practice, right? The second practice is different roles demand different kinds of stuff. So we talked about the fact, what does it mean as an exception to the user, to the business? The ability to explain clearly to different roles. How can I shadow different roles, understand what they need, and therefore use their lingo? And finally, of course, is mapping questions. What do different people need? How do I have a shared questioning mechanism? And therefore be able to sense patterns, if you will. And QA synthesis is probably not an exact role or a title. It is more like it's a lens that I'm trying to develop. So it's not like saying, here is my Ashok, the QA synthesist, as a title. Probably not. It's more like saying, hey, it's a shift, and some of these practices allowed me to sharpen my lens and go beyond the typical realm of the microscope or the telescope. And to conclude, I guess we're not just here to find bugs, synthesis per se. They hopefully enable a larger understanding, and therefore trying to ensure that the role is relevant to the modern times and continues to stay relevant as we go through. And relevance is only earned, being through clarity, via curiosity, via connection, and so on. And so I think today, interesting discussion that happened, especially with the shift in technology, the inflection point of AI, is it still relevant? Is that role needed? And the answers fly across both those realms. No, we are not needed. A lot of things can be done, and so on. That's because we are looking at it still from the act of doing, right? And therefore, we need to understand that relevance is something that will happen if we don't just think of it as finding bugs, right? And therefore, as a final statement, as a parting statement, probably the future of QA belongs to those who see the whole and shape what others overlook. And the whole, once upon a time, we just thought was the product and the software. But I guess the whole is now a larger whole, a bigger whole, and so on. Next week, I'm trying to dwell upon this, muse upon this, and then asking myself a question and then thinking about some answers on how does artificial intelligence or AI amplify being a QA synthesist?